Yeah, I think, this is all the applause I'm going to hear. I know by the end there's like 3 people left. For those of y'all who did see my data site presentation, I apologize. There's some stuff that was in there as well. And I couldn't believe I had a whole hour and a half to talk, so I'm really excited. I'm gonna use the entire thing, and I'm just gonna load it. I'm not really gonna do that. We'll go through kind of quick, and I even put in some intermissions because everybody needs a little break. So I wanted to talk about scientific revolutions a little bit. So I got my start. We're saying like a lot of LIS people in either everybody got started in either English or history, it seems like. So I was in the history group. Does anybody know Bob Hatch at University of Florida? He's kind of well known in history of science. So I was a constant disappointment to Professor Bob Hatch. And in the process of doing that, I did manage to learn a few things about history of science. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that to kind of start off with, and then move from there into describing sort of the current system, how I think the new system is going to take that over. Then I'm going to talk about metrics, how metrics have been done in the past, and how I think they'll be done in the future. And then finally, I'll say, why does all this stuff matter? I'll say, what's the scholarly communication of the future really going to look like, and how can we help make that happen? And should we make it happen? So to start off with, I would like to try and kind of say, why does this all matter, right? So scientific communication seems really nerdy. You talk to somebody like on the bus or something about it, they like zone out in like 5 seconds. But I think this is actually, if you're lucky, I think this is actually really important what we're doing here. So a lot of people have pointed this out, right? That communicating science, it's not just something that scientists do. It is science, right? Without communication, what do you have? You don't have science, you have alchemy or something, right? Where you sit around in your little room and you like try things, try and turn lead into gold and all this stuff, and you write it all in code in a little book, and then when you die, nobody knows about it, right? To do science, we actually have to communicate. We have to share with other people what we're finding. We have to hear from other people what they're finding. We have to kind of put this together into a unified whole. So I think this is a really big deal what we're doing. I think that it's really exciting to be able to talk to librarians because you guys are interested in the communication of science and of scholarship more broadly. I was talking to Beth earlier, right? It's great that I don't do a lot of library stuff, and when I started going to library school at UNC, I was like, well, this is goofy. Now I have to tell people, oh no, I'm not really a librarian, which you have to tell it to everybody. And I was like, well, this, it's kind of goofy. But I found that it was actually incredibly valuable because librarians have this perspective on information where they want to share information. They want to connect people with information. And I think that's tremendously exciting, looking at a scholarly communication system which hasn't always been that effective at doing that. So let's start with the beginning of that system, right? At the very beginning of the scientific revolution, we had the letter, right? So various scientists would correspond with one another. They would say, oh, I found this interesting thing or that interesting thing. And that worked okay, and it's certainly better than not communicating at all, but it's really slow, right? It takes time for the letter to get there. It's really costly in terms of people's time because every time, let's say I'm collaborating with all you guys, I would have to write each of you your own letter by hand, right? It's really, really sort of inefficient. Because of this problem of duplication, right? I'm constantly duplicating the same work to different people. However, it was the best solution available given the technology of the time, right? Especially the very early days of science, printing press hadn't made particularly big technical inroads on communication. So this was the best people could do. And I think that's a theme that we're going to look at as I discuss this, that scientific communication has always been limited by the best available technology. And I think that's going to be important for us to consider. So the first first scientific revolution, of course, happened rather earlier than this, but certainly a big part of the growth of science was the creation of the first scientific journal. Phil Trans and Journal des Savants, my French non-existent, which, by the way, is now open access. Very cool. So you can go back and look at like the first Phil Trans, and it's great articles. Articles are like, on a different way of storing hay in the countryside. And it's just like this guy's like tramping in the countryside. Hey, you guys are doing something. He asks everybody questions about it. It's this tremendous optimism and excitement of this perspective on the world. It says, hey, we can learn stuff by observing. It's really cool. So anyways, this applied, again, the best available technology, right? The idea was everybody's mailing these letters all the time. What if we bound all the letters together in one spot? And then we use this awesome technology, the printing press, which lets us duplicate things really cheaply and easily. And then we send that to everybody, right? Much less duplication, huge efficiencies to be gained. And the journal, of course, I mean, you may have heard of the scientific journal, right? It sort of took off. But the first revolution promoted homogeneity of output. So the idea is you're applying this sort of industrial model to scientific dissemination, right? Where you want to sort of, you duplicate the same thing over and over and over and over again, right? And that's very efficient. And particularly, we saw this sort of reach its peak after World War II, when there was huge amounts of research budgets being poured into science, and it's sort of an explosion in the literature. It became very important to create a homogeneous product, right? So we get the sort of sections, right, of the classic literature, the classic research article, right? We see the introduction, lit review, methods, discussion, stuff like that. Because you want to be consistent, right? It's like when you're building a car, right? You want to have every single piece exactly the same as the other piece. Every transmission has to look exactly the same. Every tire has to look exactly the same. So it all fits together. And this was definitely the model that was being applied to journals, right? It was industrial scale replication, and then we're promoting homogeneity. And that had good results in the same way the assembly line had good results, because you can make things more cheaply. But it had bad results also because it required research to all be fit into this one package, the journal article, right? We got sort of a monoculture of journal article, right? People talk about a monoculture of corn, right? In the Midwest, y'all are probably familiar with this, right? Like everything's about corn, right? And so some people say, well, that may be a good thing because it's efficient, but there are ways in which it's a bad thing as well, right? It kind of strains some environmental resources and things like that. The same thing was happening in the journal, right? We had this monoculture, had industrial style production. So I'm going to posit that there's a second revolution of scholarship that will be built upon today's best available communication technology, namely the web. And I think the second revolution will not be built around homogeneity of outputs, but diversity, heterogeneity of outputs, right? We create all sorts of things as scholars. Why should we have to fit them into this journal box? This journal box that's an artifact, right? That's an atavism that's left over from the early days of the journal, because this was the way that we had to do it given the existing technology. The key here is that publication is nearly free. It's very easy. It's frictionless to publish things. And I'm talking about sort of small p publishing, right? Disseminating it to a wide audience. Very easy, almost free, right? And because of that, we don't have to worry about cramming things into a box. Oops, that's the wrong direction. So what kinds of things? What kinds of things can we publish? Huge, bold words that are very important, right? So I think everything starts with the data. We have research data. Now, of course, research data has been published before. I saw a really interesting, I was visiting UW, and they showed a really cool data set that was from, I think it was from the 17th century, that was Royal Navy tide tables, and they sort of published this openly, right? So it's a great example of data sharing early on. But it's very expensive to publish data, particularly if you have big data sets in a paper journal. It's not particularly easy. It's not particularly efficient. So we didn't see much of it. But today with the web, it's remarkably easy to publish the data. And of course, there's a lot of trouble that goes along with it. You have to have metadata. You have to curate it, stuff like that. And you guys are doing really cool stuff. We were talking about Per earlier with that. But it's a lot easier than actually fitting it into a paper article and publishing it in sort of between covers. So after the data, what do we have next, right? If we're doing science, well, then we have the analysis. So you can't go straight from data to a paper. You generally have to do some sort of processing of the data that you have. A lot of times that looks like statistical analysis, but other times it can be machine learning, it can be building models, it could be all different sorts of analysis. Increasingly, we have the ability to put that analysis online as well. Sort of in the old school where you'd click a bunch of buttons on SPSS, it's difficult to move that workflow from your particular office onto the net. But nowadays, as analyses are increasingly being performed in something like R, right, where there's a record of exactly every single statistical procedure that happens. You can publish this as a text file on the web, and a lot of people are doing that. So first we've got the data, then building on top of that we've got the analysis, and then we've got stories. Stories are the part that sort of makes it all come together. Traditionally, a story has just been an article, right? You publish an article, and that's kind of the story about, this is the data I got, this is what I did to it, and this is what I found, and this is why it's important to you guys, right? There has to be a who cares with an article, because it's a story, right? A story has to have a who cares. I think it's interesting. When you think of a story in nonfiction, or excuse me, in fiction, right? You have a protagonist, you have an antagonist, there's conflict, there's growth in the character by the end, right? Those the half of you that came from the English background are familiar with what I'm talking about, right? The same, I think, is true in nonfiction, where you tell stories about data, right? You have a protagonist, right? You have the researcher, right, who's doing this stuff. You have an antagonist. You have ignorance, lack of knowledge, right, where you're trying to kind of go against. And you sort of have growth over the course of the article. You see, hey, at first we didn't know all this stuff. We have a hypothesis. We're like, oh, is it true? Isn't it true? And then over time, you have this sort of conflict between how to do the study, right? You have all these impediments that you have to get around. You kind of talk about in the methods section. And then finally, discussion section, and in the conclusion, then you kind of wrap things up, right? The character has grown, you've learned things, you know things about the world that you didn't know anymore. So we tell these stories. These stories are absolutely essential, and traditionally, this is the only part we've had. We've just had the stories. Moreover, we've only been able to tell certain kinds of stories. In nonfiction, we can tell all kinds of stories, right? I can tell a story at any length I want. I can tell, huge multi-volume, fiction like Dos Passos, right? USA, one of my favorite things ever. I wanted to get it for my a friend of mine. I was like, oh, I'll get him USA, Dos Passos. This is great. It's like 3 volumes, and I realized it's like 10,000 pages. I was like, you can't get this for someone. It's like a death sentence. They have to spend the next 5 years reading this thing. So I just got him one book. But anyways, we should be able to tell stories that big, right? And we should also be able to tell stories all the way at the very other end, right? I subscribe to a Twitter account that's Twitter fiction, right? And it's all these like Ernest Hemingway style, right? Like Baby Shoes Slightly Used, right? The world's shortest story and saddest. And so there's all these tweets about like really tiny stories, right? And we've got a range of everything. Like fiction writers can publish novellas, novelettes, omnibuses, all these different kinds of things. As researchers, we can publish an article or a monograph. And in some fields, there's some space between it, but that's about it. And so I think in the future, we're going to be able to tell stories at different lengths. Increasingly, we can do that today with blog posts. People can tweet about their research. But I think in the future, we're going to see a tremendous amount of breadth about the types of stories that we can publish and the level of formality at which we tell those stories. And then finally, there's a conversation. Again, this part has always existed. And I want to emphasize, I'm not talking about anything new here. I'm not saying, oh, I invented data. It's going to be great, guys. No, I'm saying that data has always underlaid. Data has always underlaid good science, right? But we haven't had a way to disseminate it, to communicate it, right? Analysis, obviously, has always been part of science, but it's been expensive and difficult to communicate in a reproducible way. Obviously, stories always been. Same with conversation. In fact, conversation is arguably the most important part of what we're doing in science. Because this is where the invisible colleges get created. So DeSalle Price, he talked about the idea of an invisible college, right? You have universities that everybody sees, but the real work happens in these invisible units that are made of your closest collaborators and the sort of, maybe the circle a little bit outside your closest collaborators. You meet each other at conferences, you talk about the latest work, you say this is interesting, this is stupid. That's where scientific progress actually happens, in these conversations. These conversations are extraordinarily important. And increasingly, we have ways of publishing the conversations. We have ways of growing the conversation. So I kind of like him. So I'm pretty active on Twitter, and because a lot of the people in my discipline are, or my, I guess, area of inquiry. And it's like being in a conference with people all the time, every day, right? Which can be a little exhausting, right? And you tend to ignore some stuff. But it's kind of, you're always seeing this conversation. For me, in my Twitter feed, it's really valuable. It's like I'm always at this conference. So it's kind of cool. So this idea of new tools for conversation, I think about as looking beneath the foliage, right? You can kind of think of, there's a sort of ecosystem of scholarly communication, whatever. Maybe I overload that metaphor, but we've been able to see the leaves of the trees, right? It's like we're looking from above. But that's not the soil from which the scholarship springs, right? That's only the end result. That's the end product. We know that research actually springs from the soil of invisible colleges, of conversations with colleagues, right? And increasingly, we have ways of making these conversations easier and, I think, crucially, more visible. So reference managers like Zotero and Mendeley, a lot of y'all are probably familiar with. Blogs, of course, everybody knows about. Social bookmarking, social networks. These are different ways that facilitate conversations that, again, are not new. They've always been going on, right? But they can be broader, they can be faster, they can be more effective, in the same way that the printing press transformed the communication of research from a letter-based system, right, to this sort of widespread, easy dissemination. I think web tools are transforming the dissemination of the informal, right? The printing press said, here's your formal research story. Let's do a better job of that. The web is making your informal research story significantly more effective and significantly more efficient. So a couple examples of that. Y'all are probably familiar with Mendeley. Any Mendeley users here? Anybody? Cool, awesome. Does anybody who raised your hand want to give us a quick summary of what it does? Yeah, go for it.
So it's reference managers allow you to download not only regular citations from a database, but also to do kind of a one-click capture of where you've been on the web, and then it also allows you to create groups so that other people can see your citations as well. And it also then has kind of a brief chat form as well, where you can post information about specific articles or what you found or
Awesome, thank you. Much better than I would have done. Yes. This is the great thing of audience participation, right? So like I'm not actually that good at this stuff, and you guys are. I think the key thing that you mentioned is the social aspect. I think that's a really big difference for people. So 1.6 million user libraries, obviously not all of those are as active as some of them. This blows my mind, though, right? 160 million papers. Now, the deduplication of those is a little dicey, so certainly there's a couple double counts here. But even including that, this is actually a pretty substantive portion of all of the research that has ever been published by humanity. Right? I mean, there's different estimates for that, but people have estimated no more than 200 million articles have ever been published. So that's kind of mind. I mean, this has less formal stuff as well, but that's kind of blowing my mind, especially when you consider Medline, which is a pretty, as you guys know, pretty comprehensive resource, is vastly, vastly less than that. So Mendeley has really sort of taken off. Another example is Twitter. I've done a lot of research on Twitter, partly because I use Twitter a lot, so you kind of research what you're interested in. So 58,000 citations from Twitter to scholarly article. I like saying citations because it's dumb and Twitter is dumb, so it works out. There's a lot of goofy nonsense on Twitter, right? But there's a lot of, I think, valuable scholarship happening on Twitter as well. I was telling you guys earlier that I stopped reading journal tables of contents, and people are like, I can't believe you did that, right? And the reason is because everything that I need to read, I find surfaces in my Twitter feed. I follow maybe a couple hundred people, but they're the couple hundred people that matters to me in my research life, and I find that if it's important, one of them will probably tweet about it. Unlike journal tables of contents, where I have to scan through a huge amount of stuff that doesn't really relate to me, I generally get stuff that's pretty focused on my interest and actually from a broader set of things. So I kind of get better precision and better recall from Twitter. One of our studies, so we did a study on this, and she said, it's like having a jury pre-select what will probably interest you. Occasionally it'll be something that people will link to, and it'll change what I think or what I'm doing or what I'm interested in. To me, that sounds pretty significant. And obviously not every researcher uses Twitter in this way, but at least for some of them, it's a pretty vibrant and important part of their research lives. So as part of this study, we also tracked the number of people on Twitter. It's not as high as I might have expected because I think in my little subfield it's pretty high. But overall, it's about 3.5%. And if you look of scholars who are active on Twitter, and it's interesting, if you look at the distribution, it may vary by subfield a little, but in terms of large fields, like looking at humanities, social science, physical science, we found no significant differences in adoption, which I think is pretty cool. We also found no significant differences in adoption between PhD students and postdocs versus faculty. Both of them sort of adopted it at the same rates. So I think it's interesting and I think kind of exciting for me to see that adoption is broad across the academy. It's not just a couple nerdy CS students or whatever. I say that as a computer guy myself. But the other, I think, really interesting, so you can't see it really easy down here. This is 2008 on the end, and that's 2011 over on the other end. You can see that Twitter has become increasingly used by scholars, right? So there's only like one lone scholar in our sample tweeting down here. By the time you get all the way to the end, it's quite a few. And this is from a pretty representative sample. We got this from 5 universities. We found 10,000 scholars by looking at the university directories. So there's not like response bias or non-response bias in this. And a lot of that's online. So first intermission, right? Does anybody have questions about what I've gone over so far? I'm curious to see what y'all think. Yep.
I'm a little stuck on the not reading journal table of contents, not because I feel like you have to, but
yeah.
Doesn't somebody have to for them to tweet about it? So where does it start?
That's a great point, and I think it's important. I think that, yes, clearly somebody has to, right? And I find that sometimes I will, I'll be in one particular journal because somebody else tweeted me there, and I'll read another table of contents, something like that. But clearly there are going to have to be some people who do it. I think the difference is where every researcher does it now, maybe 1 out of every 50 or 100 researchers has to do it. In the future, that's, I think, a substantial time saving. Because, of course, there's value there, right? You can think of the market of ideas. Robert Sternberg's Psychology of Creativity, and I kind of quote him a lot. I don't know if you all are familiar with him. But he talks about creativity as being buying low and selling high, right? When we have ideas, no one comes up with new ideas, right? I mean, the idea in some form was probably out there already. So creative people, innovators, they find an idea that's not that popular, that's not particularly well liked. They take it, they maybe spruce it up a little bit, add their own little touches, and then they sell it later when the rest of the world is ready for it and when they've kind of made it a little bit better, right? That's kind of how creativity happens. And I think people on Twitter are rewarded for doing the same thing. If you are a consistent source of new information that the community doesn't know about, you can accrue followers and influence in the community. And the same is true in regular life, again, right? Like if you're a source of new information, people tend to listen to what you want to say. So there's certainly incentive for that. But then it's kind of balanced by the fact that it's nice to not have to read all that stuff. That's a good question, though. Thank you. Anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, certainly that gatekeeper role is not new to the digital age, as you were saying.
Right.
I do have a question about your graph.
Yeah, please do. And let me go back.
What, what are the axes and what is the?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's not very clear from back there, is it?
What are these? And it seems like it should be the lines are going this way, but it's.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's a good question. I should have explained it more. And it's probably hard to see, especially from back. So the axes, the horizontal axis is time. So this is the beginning, and that's sort of now, 2011 anyway. The vertical axis is number of people, or actually it's, number of people. So if you sort of just ignore all these little flashy bits and you just were to draw a line, it would be a pretty conventional graph. It says number of people over time. So as you see, in early times, the number of people is low. Over time, as time increases, you get more and more and more people. But I also kind of added some extra stuff. Each person that's added, I drew a line of all of their tweets. So here you see this person got added, and they've been a pretty aggressive tweeter. They've got all kinds of tweets on this line. I don't know if you can tell from back there. Whereas some of these people here started tweeting. They maybe did a couple early on, and they haven't really used the service and then started again or something like that. So it's hard to see from the back, but from up close, you get a little bit more information density. The colors represent the sort of bluish color is faculty, and the red is non-faculty. And then these bars over here represent the percentage of their tweets that are scholarly. We went through and sort of content analyzed all of the tweets to see which ones were scholarly or not. And the reason why I added those things was to see if there was any trends that could be seen over time. So if we saw all of these were red, then we would think, okay, well, evidently, the later users of Twitter are mostly non-faculty, right? And if we saw, for instance, all these bars were really small up here, we would say, oh, Twitter has grown, but they don't really talk about scholarship as much anymore. Instead, we don't see either of those things. We simply see sort of homogeneous growth, that we haven't seen significant changes in the amount of scholarly tweets or the populations on Twitter. They seem to just be growing across the board. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that helps. So you had about 100 people in your sample, is that about right?
So the sample's about 10,000, and the total.
Because those bars look like just the width of the bar per person.
So these bars?
Yeah, it looks like the width of one of those bars, I assume would be one person, but it's not.
Quite so. So we've got about 10,000 people in the sample. It actually narrowed down to 7,000 because of name matching or something like that. And then about like 200 people in this graph who are on Twitter.
So 200 people are
out of our sample.
reflected.
Yes, exactly. This represents 200 people. And we assume, if our sampling was representative, that this represents many, many more people in the population. Sorry about that. That's a good question. All right. One more. Anybody else? Please do.
So how did you define scholarly in this particular project?
Good question. The question was how we define scholarly, which I'm supposed to be repeating back there, and I just now remember to do. So we define scholarly. Trying to think if there's a fast way for me to show you the chart. There's not, but I can show you afterwards. So we actually had a bunch of other categories. So we had a Twitter citation, so it tweets directly to a scholarly resource. You figure, well, that's got to be scholarly, right? Then we figure what we called second-order citations, which are actually quite common, in which someone tweets a blog post or a news article, which is in turn entirely about a scientific article. And those are actually more common, I think, sort of because of the medium, and also, interestingly, because of access. We interviewed a lot of people. They said, well, look, I don't want to tweet this stuff because I don't know if my followers have access to it. So I'll tweet the blog post or the press release, something like that, because I know they have access to that. And we actually found, which as far as I know the first time anyone found this, a really significant open access advantage for tweets. So it's been kind of shown in citations. So I think it's kind of interesting to show this advantage for tweets, although not exactly surprising. And then some of the other things we looked at, so we looked at conversations. These were really fascinating. We would have like two people having like an argument about philosophy or something like that over Twitter. And obviously it really, in 140 characters piece, it really changes the kind of argument you could have. So it was kind of fascinating to see the sort of norms that people used for that. So that would have been a scholarly one as well if it was like about their scholarship. Where's the other ones? We had like logistics, which were quite common. So like, for instance, announcing this, right? Like some goofball is going to give a talk today. That would be, hopefully a little more specific, but that would be some goofball named Jason Priem would go talk today. That would be an example of a logistics tweet, which we counted as scholarly because it has to do with your work. So yeah, those are the main, I'm pretty sure those are the main categories. All right, so intermission over. You didn't actually get to go anywhere. You just had to listen to me talk some more. Here is the next thing. All right, Altmetrics. This is what I do, so I'm excited about this one. So to start with Altmetrics, let's take a step back again and look at history and look at the history of measuring scholarship, right? And we could go way, way, way back if we want to. Like, there's citation indexes for the Talmud. There's Shepard's citation index, some of you might be familiar with. In law was a citation index for legal cases that exists, been like, it's over 100 years old. But in widespread use, the beginning of indexing ideas or indexing the network of ideas started with Garfield in 1961 with the Science Citation Index. Didn't get really popular or heavily used for evaluation until the 70s. So Garfield's original idea was to replace the expert indexing judges with crowdsourcing. People don't think of the Thomson Reuters, sort of the staid gray lady of scholarship or something like that as a crowdsourcing service. But that's exactly what they are. So Garfield's he was interested in information retrieval. And he's looking at the IR sort of state of the field after World War II. Again, the literature is exploding, huge amounts of literature, and there's no full text search, right, at that time. And so everything is based on abstracts and indexing services. And you need experts. You need a certain amount of content expertise to do the indexing. And so for every article that gets published, you need the time of an expert to look at the article, read the whole thing, index it, and it doesn't scale. It doesn't scale at all, right? Because these experts are the bottleneck. As I was saying earlier, right? The world's most expensive resource, the most valuable resource in the world is the time of expert people, right? Everything else, right, you can buy or something else but the people who have the skills and the ability to get stuff done, their time is the most, and of course, in different fields, right? Like, I'm sort of an expert in Altmetrics, but I'm a total lack of expert in everything else in the world, right? So depending on the topic, right, the person may or not be an expert, but any system that relies on lots of time from expert people is going to have a bottleneck right there. And this was the case of the indexing service that Garfield was looking at. He says, look, why don't we crowdsource this, right? People are making these relevance judgments, these impact judgments all the time when they write, because they only cite the things that are most important to what they do. So let's crowdsource it, right? Let's let the whole of research tell us what things are important. And he was particularly interested in literature reviews at this time. He said that will replace the indexers, right? We have everyone being our indexer. Accidentally, it's a beautiful, beautiful idea, right? And the key to it, the beauty part of it, is it's based on existing patterns of use. He's not saying, hey, everybody, I've got this project. Come give me a bunch of hours of your time and we'll do something cool. Because no one's going to do that, right? You guys know it's impossible to get faculty to do anything, right? So my apologies to faculty here, right? So the idea, he says, let's use the processes that are already happening, right? And then let's build stuff out of that. And that's awesome. I think that's really exciting, right? It was a beautiful thing. And it's gone on to influence all kinds of things, right? So Page and Brin, who invented, created Google, and were very influential with PageRank stuff, they've been very clear in saying they owed a significant debt of gratitude to Garfield and this idea of mining the citation graph because it traces the lineage of ideas. And it leaves a trace unintentionally. That's the beauty part. You just watch the things that people are already doing, right? And that tells you something about the field. However, it does have some weaknesses. So it only shows us really kind of part of the picture. Remember I was saying earlier that the informal, the conversation, the data, all these sorts of things are really important, but they haven't been highly reflected in the literature. So consequently, they're not highly reflected in the citation graph either, right? So it only shows us one kind of person. It only shows its use by academics. And I was saying earlier, there's a number of statistics that the number of scientists, of working scientists who actually create peer-reviewed literature where they would have citations to mine is quite low. Tenopir and King estimate at 50%, or 15%, which blows my mind. Makes me think that maybe it was a typo or something. I know in another field, in the field of urban planning, it's like 50%. So most scientists, or at least a large percentage of scientists, work in industry or they work in government or administration, something like that, where they use research, but they don't cite it, right? So we don't get the influence on those sorts of people. It only shows one kind of resource, the scholarly article. And again, as I was saying earlier, that kind of resource is a very small subsection of what we're actually interested in scholarship. And increasingly, it's not even the only available resource. Increasingly, we have data sets, we have conversations, we have analysis. Citations does not help us with any of those. It doesn't track the intellectual lineage of those kinds of products. And then finally, it only shows one kind of use, right? So a citation, no one knows exactly what it means, but basically, Merton says it was a pellet of peer recognition, which is a very lovely kind of idea if you live in a Mertonian, normal world. But It's actually, we all know it's a little bit messier than that, right? I mean, citations reflect, personal relationships, all these sorts of things. So we don't know exactly what a citation is, or what it means, but it generally sort of means you used it in some way to support your argument or your paper or something like that. But what if you use it for something totally different, right? What if you use it to make an argument to a policymaker and change policy? Well, that citation record is not going to help you there, right? So it's a beautiful system, it's wonderful, but it captures only a very, very small subset of, I think, what we're interested in when we start to evaluate research. What about all the other uses? So this is what I was mentioning. I probably should have had this slide earlier, but these are sort of three of the great names in information science and in scholarship, or in the study of scholarship. So we've got Garfield saying there are undoubtedly highly useful journals that are not cited frequently, right? He's the guy who invented this stuff. If he's admitting there's definitely holes there, right? John Bernal is a great, he was a great scientist. He helped plan the D-Day invasions, really cool. But he also studied communication. He was very, very political, but he was really interested in scholarly communication. So he points out, right, visits, personal contacts, and letters. Again, this invisible college, right, the shadow system of scholarly communication that exists, and we all know it exists, but it doesn't leave records. This is the important stuff, he said. And later on in the quote, he actually says, but we're never going to be able to find that stuff, so shucks, right? Kuth is not a person. It's supposed to be Kuhn. My apologies. You have like the great names. Kuth. Everybody's familiar with Kuth. Someone's going to call me. I was like, who's Kuth? So spotting, imaging, and research fronts, he says, will require tracking formal and informal communication. He says, because the problem is, by the time something perturbs the citation record, it's already too late. The research front has already kind of moved on, right? Because, I mean, y'all know how it is, right? Like, you get funding, you got to do the funding process, you do all the research, blah, 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 blah. By the time you publish it, you're sick of it, right? Like, you've moved on to something else, right? So the citation record is always going to lag way behind the emerging research fronts. And again, Kuhn is I'm about to say Kuth. Kuhn is saying, we're probably not going to be able to have that stuff, though. So, oh well, we're never going to be able to spot scientific revolutions really early, because how could you ever get, right, the ephemera? How could you ever get the informal, the shadow landscape? How could you ever get the soil, right? We're only ever going to be able to see the trees. Surprisingly, Kuhn didn't write a lot about the citation mining, which is, I think, kind of interesting. So I've got this part twice, my bad. One of the side effects of relying on citation indexing, which, again, we've increasingly relied on because of the lack of experts, right? We have to turn to citation mining. One of the side effects of it that I think is pernicious and of concern, I think a lot of us who spend time in this field would agree, is that we start to confuse the kind of impact we can track with impact, right? Because you start saying, oh, this is what we can track. This must be real impact. You start to forget about the other stuff. And that's, I think, really bad. I think that's a really big concern, because it causes evaluators to just reward those kind of impacts. It causes the academy to become sort of obsessed with these impacts. I mean, I think in a lot of fields people consider, it's a fetishistic attachment to the citation, right? It's like it's a magical totemic item, right, that we have to have. And we start to lose sight, or we start to lose context of why it's valuable and what it tracks, and most importantly, what it doesn't track. And I think that's part of what kind of motivated me to get involved in tracking other things. So bibliometrics, right, Garfield's field he found, is concerned with mining impact on the first scholarly web, right? There's a web of citations, right? It connects everything to everything else, and it's built on these articles published in the 17th century technology of the printing press. That's the first scholarly web. Altmetrics is concerned with citations and mining the web of impact on the next scholarly web, which I think is the World Wide Web, right? It's this incredible internetworked set of computers that can talk to each other. And there's amazing, amazing texture and amazing diversity of things that we can measure on this next scholarly web. So I want to share a few of those. Altmetrics is not its own thing. Altmetrics is part of this greater movement towards big data analysis. So social media can predict all kinds of crazy stuff. I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with some of this literature, but it's wild. It blows my mind. So like movies. Astor and Huberman, they wrote this paper where they said, all right, we're going to track the number of Twitter mentions of a movie in the 5 days before it's released. And we'll say, like in the week, basically, I guess 5 days, a week, something like that, before it's released. And we'll see how many times people talk about the movie on Twitter. And then we'll kind of plug all those into a regression equation each of the 5 days, and we'll use it to see if we can predict the opening weekend grosses of the movie, right? The number of, and of course, this is a thing of great interest to people because it helps studios like plan their publicity and stuff like that. So he does this, and the regression equation pops out. And you got like an R squared of like 0.97, right? Mind blowing, right? It's a huge, huge R squared. It basically says we can completely describe, we can almost entirely predict the opening weekend just by the sort of Twitter buzz, which is, I think is pretty impressive. So people have done the same thing for elections. Johan Bolin did this for stock prices. So he said, let's try something really hard, right? I mean, the whole world is obsessed with predicting stock prices, right? You can get rich if you do that. Let's see if Twitter can predict stock prices. And he found, a little less robustly, but he did find that he could basically outperform the stock market at predicting what stocks were fixing to rise later on, just by mining Twitter, right? It's magic. It's amazing. I liken it to, like, talking about alchemy again, right? They were obsessed with the philosopher's stone, right? This magic stone, you put lead on it. It could be lead, any base metal, right? And you turn it into gold. Huzzah, you get rich, right? Mining social media is the same way, right? What could be more leaden than the Twitter sphere, right? A bunch of goofballs talking about what they had for lunch, right? But they also talk about a few other things. And if you aggregate them together and you apply these sort of algorithms to them, you sort of have a philosopher's stone that you turn into gold. You turn it into valuable, actionable data. So there's a lot of interest in this. So Google and Twitter have both acquired companies for this. This company called Radiant7 that was acquired for like $150 million or something. People are seeing a lot of value in this. You even see it in the culture. So like there was a really good, anybody see the New York Times article on big data this week? A couple people did? Cool, awesome. So there's going to, and then Moneyball, right? This movie that has Brad Pitt and Jonah Hill in it, and they basically, it's just this whole story, right? They say in the past, we used to look at baseball players and say, well, yeah, he looks good. He's a good-looking kid. I think he's going to be great, right? We didn't have data. But in Moneyball, they say, let's crunch every tiny little piece of data we have. Let's be scientific about it. Let's be systematic about it. And let's use that data to find players that other people are overlooking. Let's stop thinking about our gut and our impressions, which are incredibly misleading and incredibly inaccurate, and actually turn to the data because we have them now. I think that's I think, a really exciting lesson. I think I watched the movie and I'm like, that's what I do. That's pretty cool. And it's interesting. I tell a story, too, about how much we do the exact same kind of thing in academia. So one of my colleagues, I hope this wasn't one of you. One of my colleagues is the one who said this. But someone came to interview for a position at the school that my colleague was at. And my colleague could not stop talking about, not the researcher's publication history, not her interests, not her enthusiasm, nothing else. She's like, she wore yoga pants to the interview. Yoga pants! She was very upset about this. And I guess I can understand you dress for success or whatever else, but I think it's unfortunate that the person's choice of trousers or whatever, right, was overshadowing all of their research. And I think it's kind of reminiscent of, right, Moneyball, where people are saying, oh, he's a good-looking kid, he'll be a good ball player or whatever, right? In the same way, I think we kind of make decisions like that based on instincts and gut and stuff like that. For faculty, what if we could have a really, really comprehensive set of numbers and of indexes and of networks that we could use to make a more informed decision? And I think that's scary in some ways, which we'll get to later, but I think it's also powerful. So Altmetrics, which I should have introduced earlier, is measuring things other than traditional citations. And quite purposely, right, this is a negative definition, right? It says this is what we're not. I think over the future, a lot of people say, oh, Altmetrics isn't very good. A lot of people I've talked to have said, well, what happens when it's not alternative anymore? Right, when it's not alt, when it's just metrics. And I say, well, then I'll hang up my hat and I'll be like, yay, I win. I'm perfectly happy with the alt eventually disappearing. But for now, it's not alternative. So this is some stuff I forgot to mention. This presentation is online, and it's available at bit.ly, like bit.ly, /Purdue-Altmetrics. So if you want to look at, so I kind of put some links and other stuff in there. So if you want to look at it down the road or whatever, feel free. When I'm done, I'll have it written on the first slide, so I'll flash it, and that we can write down or whatever. But yeah, so you can Google this stuff if you really want to. But yeah, so we wrote this manifesto. A lot of people have looked at that. We did a workshop on it. We've got groups. There's a PLOS collection, PLOS, a Public Library of Science collection coming out in a few months that's going to have some research about Altmetrics. And there's been a lot of, if you want to see sort of like more readable introductions, there's been a lot of stuff in like the popular press that kind of details sort of the kind of things that we're doing. It's probably better that you read that than something by me, because it'll make more sense. So let's look at the research on Altmetrics a little bit. And thankfully, we're starting to have some research that we can start to make slightly more robust claims about this stuff, other than, woo, it's going to be awesome. So this is a set of PLOS articles. Again, Public Library of Science. We did about 25,000 articles, spans about 5 years worth of publication history. The interesting thing about the PLOS data set is there's a variety of different articles of different journals. So we have really high impact factor, things like PLOS Biology, PLOS Medicine. We have really niche journals. There's 7, but there's a really niche journal called PLOS Neglected Tropical Diseases. And then there's a really kind of unusual beast, PLOS One, who publishes, it's really sort of really large scale publishing. They publish, I think they're on track I believe this year it published 1% of all scholarly research in PLOS One, which is amazing. So in this fairly large data set, 25,000 articles, we said, what of these cool, altmetrics can we actually track? Which ones are available to us? So we said, well, so this, and again, it's hard to see the axis. This is 100% of the articles have some activity of the metric. This is 0%. It's probably a little boring for me to run down all these, but I'll hit the highlights. So Facebook, not that much. Wikipedia, not that much. Blog, not that much. Once you get into the scholarly services, so SiteYouLike and Mendeley, the counts go way up. So, and these are actually a little bit wrong. This is an earlier version, but there's actually, to me, the statistic is most mind-blowing, is 80% of the articles in PLOS are in at least one Mendeley library. 80%. I think that's amazing coverage, and I guess it's not surprising when you consider how many documents are in Mendeley that they would have such large coverage of things. This is not a niche thing. It's not just a few. So it looks like for some kinds of metrics, we've got a lot of data. For others, maybe not so much. I think some of it will grow, some of it won't. We'll see. This, I think, is kind of interesting. So we want to see how do all these things, this is the more recent version also, how do these things correlate with one another? So you can kind of gander at this or I could gander it for a while. I find it really interesting. But there's a couple, I guess, trends that stand out real quick. These are all citation measures. Obviously, they're going to cluster together. You see a stripe going on here. These are the readership metrics right there. They seem to correlate with everything. They correlate with both citations and with the alternative metric stuff. This group right here, which you kind of see a little bit of a square if you squint, this is, and this is obviously factor analysis is the right way to do this, and we have that as well, which bears this out. But this, I think, is a prettier way of representing it. This cluster is just strictly social media stuff, and it all seems to kind of cluster together. And then I think there's kind of an interesting group. You can see it, or you can't really see it down here. But anyways, Mendeley, SiteYouLike, and PLOS comments, which are all sort of scholarly social media. They don't correlate super well with the other social media, but then when they get up here to the citations, they correlate much better. So we see this sort of scholarly social media like Mendeley as maybe tracking citations, tracking a scholarly kind of impact a little bit closer. Whereas these ones probably are tracking more sort of popular appeal, right? Like kind of maybe exciting or interested or talks about, heart disease or dinosaurs, or that kind of thing that has sort of a popular appeal. We also looked at clustering these. This is from the same data set. We said maybe there are different kind of flavors, different styles of articles. And my collaborator on this, Heather Pavovar, who maybe some of y'all have heard of, has a great blog post on this, which you can look up on her blog, that she goes into more detail about it. Unfortunately, it doesn't really show up very well on the projector, but this is a heat map showing how the clusters are in the columns. So cluster flavor C, she calls it like flavors, like for ice cream flavors, has a lot of activity on page views and sharing. So this seems like kind of like the popular stuff. There's only about 3%. This cluster E is really dark on everything. It's like half, right? And we know that from a lot of citation research, a significant percentage of articles just kind of just sits there and no one really uses it very much. So we have this. This category is strictly Faculty v1000, which is a post-publication peer rating service. Some of y'all might have heard of that. And these ones do really on Faculty v1000. And in these two, again, it's a little subtle and it's hard to tell. But this one does really well on Mendeley and not so much on other things. This one, I can't even tell, and I can't remember. The idea is not necessarily that these are the authoritative or the canonical clusters. I think you'll probably get different clusters with different journals. And even when we ran this is k-means clustering, we ran it different ways, we got different clusters. So it's not entirely clear what the clusters are, but I think there are clusters in there. And I think they emerge. And I think more in-depth research, I think, is going to reveal these in greater detail. I like thinking about it as positions, right? If you have a basketball team, y'all do basketball in Indiana, right? I think y'all have heard of that. All right. So if you have a basketball team, right, you need people of different positions, right? So if I go out for basketball, right, my my rebound stats, my block shot stats are not actually going to look very good because I'm kind of short for a basketball player. But maybe my passing is really good. Maybe my steals are really good. And they say, oh, well, that's because he's a point guard, right? Like that's the position that he plays. So clearly, those are the stats that we're looking for. They kind of cluster together, right? Because he's kind of little guy stats, right? And then we got a center, power forward, all these different things. We actually need all these positions to make a full basketball team, right? You can't just make a basketball team full of point guards or something. So maybe we need all of these types, all these flavors, all these positions to really have a good research corpus. Maybe we need some articles that have a lot of popular appeal, that get our research out to the public. Maybe we need other articles that get lots of readership. Maybe these are being used heavily by practitioners who don't cite. Maybe we need some other articles that have a lot of citation. We need maybe each of these sort of positions to be represented in a research corpus. This, I think, is kind of cool. So you look at the tags that the authors do on PLOS. You got 2 tags from 4 authors. Then you look at the tags on Delicious and CiteYoulike. You get a really big cluster of tags that might be useful for indexing and other things. We'll go through these a little bit quick. Oops. That slide is clearly messed up, but it's a pretty picture, so I'm going to show it anyway. This is the timeline. So these are the different services. Each dot represents when in the article's life the event happened. This is 0, like when the article was published. This is 500, so 500 days after it was published. The dots are moving around. That's just jittering so that you don't plot them over the top of each other. The height doesn't signify anything. So what you see is when it's published, you get a lot of delicious bookmarks. This is one particular article. And I don't know if it's a representative article. We kind of picked one because it had a lot of activity on it. But it's certainly an interesting one. So we got a lot of delicious right when it was published. And then we get some comments and some CiteYoulike when it was published. And then really kind of nothing. And then at some point here, we get another kind of wave of things, like almost like ripples in a pond moving across the pond, right? And I think that the stone that started this ripple is probably this. This is Crossref down there, a Crossref citation. I have a feeling that probably some people saw that it was cited in something, and then the people who read it went and tweeted about it and did these other things. So this is just one article. But imagine when we could get thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of articles, and we mine all of this stuff. We can start to have a systematic understanding of how these ripples travel across and travel sort of through the ether of the scholarly meta mind, right? Of how these things move across disciplines, across fields, how they change shape over time. There's probably different shapes depending on the kind of research that you're doing. To me, this is kind of really exciting just in terms of our pure knowledge of what scientific communication looks like. And of course, because there's all this data, there's a lot of possibilities for predicting what it's going to look like in the future as well, which is the slide that I screwed up here. So Günter Eisenbach published an article in Journal of Medical Internet Research where he did a lot of things with tweets, but one of the things he looked at, he said, after 1 week, what articles are in the top quartile of most tweeted after 1 week? Now, after, I think it was 2 years, 1 year or 2 year, let's see what articles are in the top quartile of cited. Does the Twitter popularity, being the top quartile, predict citation popularity years down the road? And he found that it did. So he examined this a couple different ways, but the odds ratio one is, I think, the most compelling. If it's in the top quartile of Twitter citations after 1 week, it's 11 times more likely to be in the top quartile of citations after 1 or 2 years. I think it was 2 years. To me, that's a really compelling result that suggests that we can maybe use this to predict things down the road. Why do we want to predict it? It's not a stock market, right? But it is kind of a stock market, right? Like I was saying, you take ideas when they're low and you get a hold of them quick, and then you do awesome things with them. And if you can get them, you can predict the ones that are going to be high later. That's a real big advantage as a researcher, right? As a researcher, if you know what fields are going to be hot, what things are going to be really cited 2 years down the road, you've got a huge head start. Right? We're starting to get the chance to actually listen to this informal, and this one is all messed up on the bottom, sorry, but we get a chance to listen to this informal conversation and start to do the thing that Kuhn was saying we'd never be able to do. Right? We start to be able to do the thing where we predict research fronts as they're happening. We're listening to the conversation. I think that's really exciting. Now, I don't think we're going to get results like this everywhere. I mean, Journal of Medical Internet Research, it's right there in the name, right? Internet. Probably people tweet it probably more than something like, I don't know, Phil Trans or whatever, right? But maybe in the future, a lot of things will look like this. Who knows? I think there's a good chance. So there's a couple tools for Altmetrics that are actually working right now, if y'all are interested in experimenting with them. They're all really early. I think this is a super emerging research front. And so everything's really beta and everything. But I think in the next couple months, certainly next year, we're going to see a lot of changes in that. So some of these are PLOS article of metrics. They sort of pioneered a lot of this stuff. It's just for PLOS articles. So it doesn't really apply to the wider set of articles. For PLOS, though, it's really cool, and you can play around with them. And they got a big grant, and they're going to be really building article level metrics, which is a lot of this Altmetrics stuff, into their search tools, into their browsing tools, so that you can help to facet your search based on these sort of activity metrics. Some of these other ones, I go through them real quick. They're all sort of different. They all mostly work. They're mostly experimental, but I think they're pretty interesting. And this one at the bottom is just like these ones with only one difference, namely I made it. So I'm going to highlight it. But I think it's really exciting. I think it's a little broader than some of the other tools. And it's definitely for the long haul. We're getting, I don't know, I guess it's all negotiation or whatever. But I can definitely say that we're really confident that we're getting some good funding sources from what you call foundations to support this well into the next year and support a lot more efforts. So we're going to be getting programmers and stuff like that to really build it out. I'm going to show you real quick. You never should do a live demo, but I'm going to do a live demo. I'm crazy. All right. So this is what it looks like. The idea, and I'll go through it real quick. You can play with it on your own if you really want to. So you paste your IDs here, and there's all kinds of IDs. They're hard to see. But this is a DOI. Oops, that's not what I want to do. There's a DOI. There's a PubMed ID. This is, I think, GenBank. This is a Dryad DOI for a data set. This is just a regular web page. This is a slide presentation for a bunch of slides. So I can do this. I can also add my own if I want to in this box. But these are just the example ones. So I can also I can add collections based on other things. So I can give you, let's say, a PubMed grant. I can type my PubMed grant in there, hit import, and everything that was funded in that grant goes into my collection, every article. So if you can imagine, right, that if you're a funder and you want to see the impact of what you're funding, this I think could be a really good tool for this. I'm going to clear this one out, and I'm just going to actually use the example collection. So we go out to all of these different APIs, a whole bunch of APIs, and we get all of this information, but it takes a couple minutes, and it's already boring enough. So I'm going to just show this example one. So here we have all the articles in the collection. Now, where we can, so like PLOS gives us all this extra data, right? So they give us like number of bookmarks on SiteLike, they give us readers, they give us all this stuff. If I want to click through this, I can. So I'm going to click this, and it'll take me to the Mendeley page that we scraped to get the data. So there's provenance for the data, which I think is really important for these metrics. So I say, OK, look, it's got 18 readers on Mendeley. Can I trust that? Sure. Click on it, go through, check it on Mendeley for yourself. Some of them, clearly there's not a lot, right? It's got some citations, it's got some bookmarks, but it doesn't have any Mendeley. Others have all of this other stuff. But then we don't have to just look at articles, right? It should be the impact of all your research projects. So we can look at slides. So these are my slides. So I can see I got some Facebook likes on these slides. I got a bunch of, this is downloads and views on SlideShare. So I can say, oh, I got 316 views on SlideShare this. Right? When I'm going for TMP, I can say, look, I do a lot of slideshows, it's true. But guess what? That's not a waste of my time. People are reading that stuff. They're looking at it. They're downloading it. Not only are they reading it, but in some cases, they're tweeting it. They're Facebooking it. They're actually engaging in conversation about my scholarly work. Isn't that what we want to reward? Even if it's not the traditional product, it's the kind of conversation that we want to do as academics. So, and then also we can do data sets, right? There's a lot of interest in rewarding people for publishing their data sets, kind of doing the right thing, being virtuous, but you can't really reward people until you have the metrics for it. So we can look, if you have a Dryad data set, we can look at your most downloaded, we can look at the file views. Again, that can all be shown to administrators and stuff. This is for GenBank. And then we can also do this unknown stuff is like web pages. So some people have web pages that are really significant. So this is a YouTube video. I don't remember what it was, some kind of science YouTube video, right? Is that making an impact? Are you wasting your time doing videos? What are you doing? This is crazy. Well, no, actually, I've got 152,000 Facebook likes. At least some people are interested in it, right? They care enough to click that button. There's a web page and stuff like that. And then finally, I think this is really exciting, right? I talked about these different kinds of products, right? So we've got the data. We've got that represented. We've got the stories. We've got that represented. We've got the conversation. We've got that represented. What about the analysis? Right? A lot of people increasingly are publishing their code on places like GitHub, and GitHub awesomely tracks this stuff. So we can say FileZilla, which is an important FTP program. We can say it has this many recommenders on SourceForge, which is where it's hosted. Homebrew is a scientific computing infrastructure for something that I just remember right now. We can say it's got this many. It's got 7,000 people watching it on GitHub, right? Who are interested in the code enough to watch it. We can also track the tweets. So a lot of people have thought this particular software project was interesting enough to actually talk about it. So as a researcher, right, I now have a motivation to do the right thing, right? I can publish reproducible research. I can get credit for my data. I can get credit for my code. I can get credit for my papers. I can even get credit for my blog posts and my other sorts of discussion that I'm using. And so I'm actually getting rewarded for this really diverse range of scholarly products. So this is an example of an Altmetrics tool, and let's see. All right, and I think it's going to be big. I think it's going to be a really exciting thing. We've got a lot of, like I said, we got good money to develop it, and I think it's going to get a lot better. Like one of the things, for instance, we want to be able to do is take your CV as an academic. You've got your CV, right? Like you know the publications that you have. Why not upload your CV into Total Impact and it spits back a live CD for you, right? It parses it out, finds out what your objects are, and then when you want people to look at your CV, like if you're doing a grant or something like that, instead of showing this static thing, right? It's just a bunch of words, who cares? No one knows how much stuff has been used. You give them your Total Impact CV, and it says, each of these products, this is how much has been used. You don't have to make this extremely bad and unsupported proxy for quality, which is look at the journal. And we all know that journal, sort of impact distributions are long-tailed, and that for a given journal, 50% of the citations come from a really small percentage of the article. Even if I got published in Nature, that doesn't mean my article was actually used by anybody. Instead of using those proxies on the CV, we can look at the actual impact. We can see this is how many citations it got, this is how many conversations it was part of, this is how many people read it, that kind of thing. One of the things people are concerned about with Altmetrics is gaming. And I don't have time to go into that in great detail, but at least we'll skim over it a little bit. Citations are harder to game, right, because you have to get them into the record. But they're not infinitely hard to game. People game citations all the time. There was a recent study in Science, some of y'all might have seen. 20% of the people they surveyed had been asked by editors of journals to include more citations to things in that journal published in the last 2 years. Wonder why that particular thing, right? Because that's the impact factor window, right? So the journal editors are gaming this. I mean, an extreme case of it was a great one for the Times Higher Ed ranking. This university in Alexandria is like Alexandria University. It ranked above Georgetown. It was like top 50 or something. People looked at it and were like, this is crazy. How can this happen? Somebody said, it's not the best university in Egypt. It's not even the best university in Alexandria. How is it getting so high? So they looked into it a little bit. It turned out it was one guy. One guy was the editor of a journal. He also published heavily in that journal. And he only cited that journal. Right? And by doing this, he was able to pump up the citation counts of himself and of his department and of his journal so high that he even boosted the citation counts of his entire university up to the point where it's altmetrics with Georgetown and other sort of bigger name universities, right? So it's possible. The gaming happens, right? It happens in the citation record. It's going to happen in the Altmetrics record as well. But the more data you have, the more unusual patterns stand out, right? If I steal any of you guys' credit card, it's actually not that easy for me to get away with it, because once I start using it, there's enough data out there from the credit card companies that they catch the patterns of a person who stole a credit card pretty well, right? I think the same can be true for Altmetrics. We can catch the patterns of people trying to game them, right? They happen all within the same time period. The numbers are out of whack across different services, right? Algorithmically, we're going to have good ways of detecting this, I think, in the future. Particularly, like I said, we have multiple data streams. It's going to be hard to game them all at the same time. Community policing does work. It works in the case of citations a lot of times, right? We catch people who game the citation record a lot of times. And I think it can work in the case of Altmetrics as well. And more importantly, in practice, gaming just isn't that successful in this stuff. How easy is it to game Google? Should be pretty easy, right? There's millions of dollars in it for you. All you got to do is you got to farm out links. There's a whole field of black hat SEO. This is all they do. They earn their living on this. And yet Google is not a worthless resource. It's actually a pretty good marker of quality still, right? Because there's a sort of spy versus spy war. Every time the gamers come with something, the people who run the algorithm come with something kind of in combat. And in practice, that's been pretty effective. Google still works. SSRN is another great example. Social Science Research Network. Anybody know that? Can you explain to us? Do you mind? I'm putting you on the spot. Sorry. If you don't want to, you don't have to.
So it's basically like a collection of social science research, open access, available online, mobile downloads, mobile apps.
Awesome. Thank you. That's great. The interesting thing about Social Science Research Network, I talked to Greg, the guy who runs it. I talked to him a lot over the last week, and I had no idea how big a deal this is in business schools and in law schools. This is used to compute real rankings for law schools that actually make a difference. And so he has a lot of examples of gaming. People try and game it pretty aggressively. In fact, he was saying for every real download they have more than one fraudulent download. And they catch these really well because there's a sort of constellation of data that they gather about the people who download it. You get stuff back from the browser, you get the time, you get the IP address, all these kinds of things. And they're able to do a pretty good job, a pretty sophisticated job of catching people who do this fraudulently. And again, this is not new, right? I mean, people have been trying to defraud online ads by fake clicks for a long time, right? But there's a lot of money that goes into finding ways to detect them as well, algorithmically, and it's not ineffective. So another problem with Altmetrics is different audiences. A lot of people say, why would I pay attention to the blogosphere? It's a bunch of idiots writing about who knows what, right? Even worse is the Twittersphere, Facebookosphere, right? Why would I pay attention to these people? I want serious judgments by serious scientists. And that's a reasonable point. I think in one sense, we actually kind of want that diversity. But in another sense, it can be a problem. It can be high noise to the signal. So I think there's two ways we can do this. One of them is to pay attention to the network, right? So I got this article about Altmetrics in the Chronicle of Higher Education, and my sister is awesome, and she Facebooked it. My brother Facebooked, and a lot of people I knew Facebooked it, right? And they're like, oh, this is awesome, my brother is famous, right? And so I was like, guys, it's like a trade publication. It's not a big deal. But they were really excited because they're my family, right? And they put it up on the refrigerator, I'm sure with a magnet or whatever. So they were really excited about this. Is that an indicator that my research is high quality? No. It's an indication my family loves me and they're extremely tolerant of the goofy stuff I do, right? It's not useful. If you mind that, it's not helpful. But if you mind who my family is, then it is useful. Then it becomes useful. You say, what else has my family done on Twitter or on Facebook to suggest that they're an expert in the field of scholarly metrics? Well, not really much. That's just not what they do. But then you look at somebody else, right? Someone who actually maybe does know what they're talking about, right? And if they tweet it, well, then maybe you pay more attention to that. It's exactly the same thing PageRank does for Google, right? Not every link counts the same, right? Some links are more valuable because they come from more trusted sources. And I think the same will be true over the long run with social media. We're going to look at the properties of the network. And of course, people who have shown themselves to be good predictors, people who have shown themselves by their networks to be valued by their community, of course they're going to get a bigger than average say in what things are valuable. We're not going to listen to everybody the same way. Secondly, I think this is really cool. The multiple audiences helps you actually sort of triangulate the influence. So what I call the fruit bat problem, because the most popular article, the greatest achievement, the pinnacle of contribution that PLOS has made on the world is, if you look at download statistics and Altmetrics, an article called Fellatio in Fruit Bats. Right? That's the pinnacle of a contribution of science of PLOS, right? Obviously, I mean, I don't know, maybe a very good article. I'm not, a wildlife behavior, animal behavior specialist or whatever. But it's probably mostly famous just because it has sort of a sensational title and topic matter, right? So you look at the Altmetrics for that. Mendeley is really high. A lot of people Mendeley bookmark it. A lot of scholars bookmark it because lol. A lot of just sort of general audience people were interested, so like Facebook, that kind of thing. So that tells us something about the article, right? It had really high general interest. What about an article that has really high Mendeley and really low Facebook, right? We can use the difference between those two audiences to tell us something about the academic value, right? An article that's really high Mendeley and really low Facebook isn't very interesting to a general audience, and yet it is very interesting to scholars. So that tells us something about who will find it interesting, right? You can almost think of Facebook, if we're looking at an equation that predicts or identifies scholarly value, we can almost look at Facebook as sort of a negative term in a regression equation, right? Where it sort of gives us the opposite, all right, of what we're looking for. And of course, that's facile, that's naive, right? When we actually turn the machine learning algorithms loose on this and we incorporate multidimensional input from all these different services, I think we're going to have something very powerful that will be able to identify the audiences that we're interested in. All right, so why Altmetrics? This slide is boring. I'm just going to focus on one particular thing. When we can quantify impact, it means the machines can start making relevance judgments for us. The machines can learn what's important. And that's extraordinarily powerful because it removes this big bottleneck of having experts tell us what's important. Right? Remember when Garfield started the SI, right? The big value there was he freed up all the time of these experts, right? The most valuable resource. He said, y'all experts, don't spend all your time indexing. That's a waste of your time. Do some science, right? We're going to track the conversations that are already there, right, to get relevance judgments from the hive, from the crowd, right? Altmetrics lets us do the exact same thing, only in infinitely more detail, infinitely more diversity, and infinitely more subtlety. Right? We can see the entire conversation, all the objects, all of the conversations, all of these things. And it's early now, right? Not all this stuff is online. But in the future, it will be, right? We're going to be able to see all of this stuff. And we're going to be able to allow the machines to make some of these judgments in the same way that Garfield did. All right, second intermission. I'm running slightly behind schedule, so I'm going to do 2 questions. Anybody questions? Yes?
I have a two-part question.
Go for it. You're going to take up both questions just for me. No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Related.
I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Where do institutional repositories come into this, and also publisher counts of subscriber use of their journal articles?
So great questions. That's indeed a 2-part question. So IRs come into it and disciplinary repositories come into it because they do a pretty good, so the disciplinary repositories do a pretty good job of making this stuff available. So like Dryad does that. Institutional repositories are much more inconsistent. In theory, they'd all be connected with OEI PMH. I could just do one query. It'd be awesome. In practice, that doesn't happen that much. We're working with some institutional repositories for total impact because we want to try and get that. But realistically, it's very difficult because you don't want to do the same thing with hundreds and hundreds of IRs getting all of their download counts. So until there's a good way to aggregate them together, I think it's going to be slow going. Obviously, they can individually do this, right? So one of the things about Total Impact that we're going to do is we're going to allow it to be embedded in other systems. So if you have an IR and you want to get all this other impact information, it's going to have an API. It's all free, it's all free and open source or whatever. So you just basically put a line of JavaScript in there, and line of JavaScript gets the DOI or the identifier or whatever thing you have in the IR, puts it in Total Impact, gets all the statistics, and then whoever's browsing your IR can see all these other statistics. So that's how Altmetrics can go into the IR. Getting Altmetrics out of the IR at scale is a really challenging problem to date. Publishers, it's even more challenging because publishers see this as a source of valuable business intelligence for them. They're not keen to get away, so I don't know how many are familiar with Purist and Purist 2 projects. So Counter was an effort to release usage data out to the libraries. It's been fairly successful. It's aggregated, so it's not article by article. It's just sort of monthly use. Purist is an effort to sort of do that right. So do it article by article and make it more available for sort of public consumption. Both those projects, they're not fast, we'll put it delicately. And publishers don't see huge incentives to do it. So part of the reason I got interested in Altmetrics is because I was frustrated at the difficulty of getting these download stats. And basically, when you look at something like Mendeley, you're still getting usage stats, but you're getting it from the client. You're getting it at the point of use rather than from the provider. Both data sources are open, and I think someday in the future, we're going to have detailed downloads for everything, but until then, we won't. Yes, last one. Go for it. Yeah, please, sorry.
As you may know, we're progressing towards maybe an open access policy.
Yeah, I heard about it. It's very exciting.
We'll have to go out and talk a lot to faculty about why open access is a good thing.
Yeah.
And specifically about why deposit into the institutional repository of their already published materials is a good thing. The open access citation advantage, what's your perspective there? Because we want to be quite nuanced, because we don't want to be caught out by people going, when you drill down, there's some issues.
Right.
So we want to give a nuanced but persuasive message.
That's a good question, and one that I probably don't have time to answer in fullness, but I'll give you at least because there's quite a lot about it. So, of course, Stephen Hart has been associated with a lot of efforts to show this open access citation advantage. A lot of studies have shown it in a number of different fields, but there are still, I think, very reasonable concerns that these are driven in large measure by authors selecting their best publications to make them open access, which then, of course, gives a sort of spurious advantage to the open access because it's better work, so it gets cited more often. Phil Davis did 2 studies on this, one of which was sort of premature released, and then a few months ago he released another one, which I'd encourage you to check out, which was a randomized controlled trial, which actually didn't give wasn't very supportive to the open access citation advantage. Certainly in the stuff that I know more about, like the Altmetrics, obviously there's going to be an open access citation advantage, right? Because a lot of the audiences simply don't have access to it. It's a little bit trickier to see if that's going to happen in real citations, but traditional citations. My take on the citation advantage has always been this: are you a scientist or not? If you're a scientist, you care about letting people read your science. If you're not, I think you're an alchemist. I think you're just huddled in the corner writing in your little book for yourself, and I think it's ridiculous. That's sort of my take. I mean, but obviously that doesn't convince everybody, right? And I think that's tricky. I think arguing from the citation advantage yields the moral high ground in some ways. Because what if there was a citation advantage the other direction? Would we say don't make your research open? I don't think we would. I would say this is the correct way to do it. I mean, there's other arguments you can make too, right? Like in the developing world, there's tremendous interest in open access because they can't get it otherwise. Obviously from practice and from clinicians, tremendous interest in open access. And what perhaps might be more valuable is that there's a very clearly established open access readership advantage. And again, this is affecting clinicians and affecting policy and other things like that. So I think this is valuable, but I think the key is, what are you here for? Like really, why do you do this? Is it really to make money? I mean, you're probably in the wrong field. You could be in industry, right? Or is it to add to the world's knowledge? You don't add to the world's knowledge by stuffing something in a bucket and paying for glances at it. So that's my take.
So focus on the usage advantage rather than the citation advantage?
I would, yes. And I think on the moral high ground, but I'm an idealist like that. I can afford to be, right? Because I don't have to make tenure and stuff. All right, someday, I guess. So we're going to go pretty fast through this because I have managed to use up even the enormous hour and a half that I was granted. So the gist is I think that journals need an upgrade. Some of this I kind of talked about already, but I think a key take-home from this is to say that the current system was created in the 17th century using 17th century technology. And today, we still have the best scientific communication system that we could using 17th century technology. And I think that's kind of a shame. I think we should be using today's technology. We could. And I think that Altmetrics can kind of help make that happen. We don't use the web, right? So when Berners-Lee started the web, originally there was a list at CERN of all the web pages. Just a list of web pages, because there were no web pages that weren't on the list. That blows my mind. It's like, this is the web pages. Enjoy our list of the web pages, right? That seems ridiculous today, but we're actually in a similar place in scholarship, right? It's manual. There's lists of journals, right? And it's curated and everything. This is stupid, right? In the long run, we're not going to have lists. We're going to have algorithms. We're going to have vast data sets of scholarly products, and the algorithms will crawl these, and they'll make sense out of them using available metrics. Metrics gleaned from people's conversations, metrics gleaned from citation, metrics gleaned from quantitative and qualitative peer review. I think that's what the future is going to look like. Today, so there's four major functions of the journal. And this is a lot of the literature. Some people say 5, some people say 6. There's generally this sort of really widely accepted, I guess, set of 4. Archiving is kind of the base, right? You got to have an identifier and sort of a place to store it. Archiving just makes sure it's going to be there in the future. Dissemination, right? You've got kind of different subthings. You got to market, search, publish, prepare, things like that. But you got to get the research out there. Registration is one of the 4 functions, but I kind of stick it down here because I think once you've got it archived and disseminated, you've kind of already got it registered. You can kind of prove that like this idea was published by this person at this time, which is the idea of registration. And then finally, certification. And this is actually the really important one because this is actually the only thing that journals do today, I would argue. I would argue that the registration, archiving, and dissemination functions are totally solved and entirely trivial. Right? Archive.org can do it for $7. They estimate about $7 an item, right? So a lot of IRs can do it for even cheaper. That problem is entirely solved. We do not need journals for that. The one thing journals do that we need is certification, right? They give feedback to the authors, and they give it a stamp. They say this was published in wherever, and this stamp has some kind of value, some kind of a weight. That's really important. We can't get rid of that. We need that. The problem is this is split into silos right now, right? We got journal A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Each journal operates its own, and sometimes it's shared amongst publishers, but mostly it's operates its own vertically integrated system where the journal archives it, the journal disseminates it, the journal certifies it, and then the next journal does all the same things. And they each have their awful homegrown systems, right? They have these search systems, like you go to Elsevier or whatever, and you search for an article. Who does that? Who says, I want the best article on this topic that Elsevier has? Nobody does, right? You just want the best article on the topic, right? I mean, they spend huge amounts of money on these vertically integrated systems that are kind of worthless. So I suggest that what we need is a decoupled journal. We need to decouple the function of the journal and let individual service providers do them. So I think we need a base layer that has identity with the DOI system that allows us to publish and store in a whole bunch of institutional and discipline-specific repositories, right? So we should be able to publish all these different places. All we need is something persistent. It's got DOI. It's on the internet, so it's published. It's stored, so we have to have someone that has some kind of infrastructure that at least gives us the hope of persistence, right? Which is all we've ever really had anywhere. So that we need, that's the base layer. Already exists, done. We've got it, right? You guys have one right here. Then why don't we have services to do the preparation for us? We already kind of do that. If I submit to something to PLOS One, they do not do copy editing. They say, sorry guys, you're on your own for copy editing. We don't do that. If you want to copy edit, go take one of these services. There's dozens of services out there who do the copying for you. Right? They've decoupled it. They've peeled it off. And the advantage to that is there's 2 big advantages. Number one, if I think I'm a good copy editor, I don't have to pay for that. Right? I save some money on that. A bigger advantage is it lets people innovate in that space. Right? I don't have to start a whole new journal if I want to just do copy editing better. I can just say, we've got a better copy editing service. Right? And it allows us to innovate. Search, the same thing. Right? There's a bunch of search services that I can use. And each one can innovate on their own. Each one can offer their own value. Each one can compete. Marketing, same thing. Assessment is the big one. Assessment, I think, is the revolutionary part. Why should the same organization that publishes the material also assess the material? There's no particular reason that has to be true, right? What if you publish something in your IR and you come to me and you say, hey, Jason, you're an expert in molecular biology or whatever, right? Can you get some people in molecular biology to come peer review my work? What if I do the exact same system, the exact same peer review process that I would have done an article on this institutional repository published item? Why Why not? I mean, we could certainly do that, and it has significant advantages. You can compete, again. You can have multiple ones. Why should you have to get a stamp from just one entity? Why don't you get a stamp from some service over here that's really good at statistics? So you get a statistics stamp, and you get a stamp from another organization over here that's really good at the content. You get a content stamp, right? You can get dozens of these if you want. And the beauty part is while it's getting stamped, it's out there. People can see it, right? People can use it. And the 5 people in your field who are actually the most qualified to tell you if this is good or bad, they don't need it peer reviewed. They already know if it's good or bad, right? They're going to read it either way. This is the model that archive.org works on, right? The physics community is specialized enough. Every physicist in the world, when they do some physics and they write it up, they put it on archive.org. It doesn't have to be peer reviewed first, because if you're in the field, you know what's valuable, you know who is important, and you're able to filter it because it's cut up into very tiny segments. It doesn't scale very well because a lot of the other research isn't cut up so finely. But if we had systems like this that could do some of the cutting, that could do some of the sorting, that could do some of the peer review, I think that would be really useful, especially given that we don't have to just do qualitative peer review. We could do quantitative peer review. We could aggregate all of these judgments. Remember what I was saying, right? The idea is we crowdsource it. We get the stuff that's already going on. We listen to those conversations. Bring those in. Bring in the Twitter conversations, the blog conversations, all these other kind of things. Slice and dice them, use algorithms, do what Google does with PageRank, right? Where they have really sophisticated ways of mining signal from all of this noise. Apply this signal to these published items. Use that as a way to rank it. Right? Why not? Right? And the proof is in the pudding. If it's decoupled, if I can do a good job of that, great. If I can't, I fail. Fine, I go out of business. It allows the market sort of forces to work on this. I'm going to skip the example because I'm moving quickly. Yeah, I'm going to skip the example. I will give you a quick example in my own work, which I thought was pretty cool. I published an article on the Decoupled Journal, or I submitted the article. It's still in press. Lo and behold, a year later, very exciting. But what I did is I asked the people, I said, can I just publish the Google Doc that I used to write this? Can I just publish it and just share it with my Twitter feed? They're like, sure, whatever. So I did that, and I shared with my Twitter feed. And the great thing about the Twitter feed is it's almost like a miniature journal. Everyone in the world who would care about my work, the like 4 people in the world who would care about my work, they follow me on Twitter, and they're actually interested in what I have to say, right? Because they do my work, so why not? So they read it. Just the fact that I wrote it is enough to make them read it. They don't need it peer reviewed. The peer review is them. They would be the peer reviewers, right? So they read it, they look at it, they either hate it or they don't hate it or whatever. And if they like it, maybe they disseminate it to their networks as well, right? So we've got basically this network effect working where the marketing and even a lot of the certification is handled by my network. So what's cool about that is I went and I talked to Johan Bolin, who's kind of a big figure in a lot of this stuff, way, way more important and famous to me and everything. And so I was talking to him like last week, and I was like, oh yeah, I published this article that was really cool, but it hasn't been published yet because it's in press. It was like a Google Doc. He's like, oh yeah, I know, I read it. I was like, that's so cool. He's like a way bigger deal than me, and he read it just because it kind of made its way. He's not even on Twitter. It just kind of made its way, to him. So I think that's a really exciting story about how this could scale. And of course, that's really ad hoc. What if we had systems that just did this? What if we had a system when I woke up in the morning, I looked at my my research system, instead of reading my tables of contents, I looked at my research system, and it sent me the 5 most important articles to me published that week or whatever that day, right? And it used an algorithm to determine this. It looked at the tweets from people in my network. It looked at blog posts from people in my network. It looked at all of these different indicators, all these different features, they call them machine learning, right? All these different signals of quality, and it pushed it to me. And when I look at it, I can even vote things up or down. I said, look, you algorithm, you suck. Don't do that, right? And I push it down, and it doesn't give me that next time. Right? And maybe this thing called filter bubble where I just only see things that are kind of in my bubble. So maybe it throws in a random one too, right? And over time it tunes it. And why would I need a journal anymore? I get everything I need delivered right to me. And I think that's what's really exciting about this decoupled journal idea. We can have multiple services doing that, multiple services competing on that, right? Because if they do a good job of that, they prosper. If they fail, they go away. Just like, right, we had search engine wars in the 90s, right? It was like Google versus like Alta Vista and all these other different people, right? All of those are gone. Because they did a bad job compared to Google, right? Google did a good job, so people go with Google. We need a Google of scholarly information, and I think we're going to get it eventually. I think information overload is good. People say, oh, you're going to publish more. That's terrible. Like, we can barely even read the stuff that we have. But overload is only a problem when you curate it manually. That's when it's a problem. When you curate it automatically, the more information you have, the better it gets. Just like Google, right? Imagine an internet of 20 pages. Google would be worthless, right? You wouldn't need it. Yahoo started out, right? They were information directory, right? Everything was manually curated. Yay, this is much better. But it didn't scale. It was a failure, right? When you have a lot of data, you can scale. I think of it in terms of like judo, right? Like the idea of judo is you sort of use someone's weight and you kind of use against them. So kind of the heavier they are, the better it works. Or another way I think of it is instead of turning off the data taps, we build boats and let researchers kind of sail around on this data. It's kind of a goofy metaphor, but I like it. So how do we build the Decoupled Journal, right? So we asked the question, what would the scholarly communication system look like today if we built it from scratch? A lot of people ask that question. I would argue, who cares? We can't do that. It doesn't matter, right? I mean, this is the system we have to work within it, right? So the real question is, how can we smoothly transition from today's system to the system of the future? And I would suggest one of the keys is building and using new tools. That's why I've put a lot of my time into Total Impact. That's why I think a lot of people are putting sort of investment into it. I think that's a really good approach. I like the idea of giving people live CV. I like the idea of letting people consume sources of Altmetrics easily, letting them embed it. So we've got a lot of interest from journals who say, look, let me embed the total impact stats in my journal. We say, yes, exactly, that's what you want to do. And then finally, I think we need to look at denominators, right? So if I have 100 downloads, is that a lot? Is that a little? I don't know. Like we have to have a meaningful denominator for those so that we can say, for your field, you've actually got a pathetic number of downloads or a magnificent number of downloads, right? It could be either. Right? In the same way that citations, right? A highly cited physics paper looks terrible as a biomedics paper, biomedical engineering paper, something like that, because different fields have different norms. I'm going to have time. This is awesome. So there are actually a couple people using this right now, or doing this model, at least close to it. So Faculty of 1,000 Research, I think is a really interesting one. They are basically going to say, we'll publish anything, and we will do the peer review on top of that. You want to publish a data set, you want to publish code, whatever you want. Faculty of 1,000 will give it a home, we'll persist it. I don't know if they give it a DOI, they're still thinking about it. And we'll add peer review on top of it. And the peer review will be post-publication. So I think that's really exciting. Faculty of 1,000 Research hasn't dropped yet. They're sort of in like open comment stage. But I think it's really cool. The blogosphere, we already kind of have that, right? I mean, a lot of people to comment on arsenic life, or NASA released this paper, said, oh, arsenic is one of the building blocks of life in this one weird microbe. And a lot of people pushed back against that on the blogosphere. They said, actually, that's not really true. You guys published a little bit too quickly. And it ended up being a really robust peer review entirely in the blog system. A peer review that caught stuff that the real peer reviewers missed. Right? Think about it. How are any two people in a field going to be smarter than everybody in the field? There's no way. For those articles that can attract attention from everybody, which admittedly is not all of them, right? The field as a whole, the blogosphere, or whatever other sort of crowdsource way we have, is always going to be more effective than the two peer review system that we have today. Now, granted, those articles have to attract attention, but that's exactly the articles we want to be peer reviewed, right? The articles that are boring that no one reads, I don't really care how much review it gets because I'm not going to read it. The really important findings, the signal findings, the vital findings, those ones tend to attract lots of people going after it, reviewing on a blog and stuff like that, and that's exactly what we want. SSRN we kind of already mentioned. I can't believe how much SSRN, it blew my mind how much it was used in tenure decisions, in ranking decisions. Like, it's pretty intense. There's definitely a lot of value and importance put on these in business schools and law schools. Archive.org you already know about. Math Overflow is really cool, and I won't have time to talk about it much. It's basically, it's a forum, like a question and answer forum for math built on Stack Overflow, which was for programmers. And the cool thing about it is you get reputation based on how many questions you answer and how many votes you get or something like that. So this is getting cited. This is cited in Archive. There are Math Overflow questions are cited in Archive. There's an Archive article that said about a certain math problem. They said it was Math Overflow hard. That's how hard it was, right? It was hard enough that it would have to end up on Math Overflow. So this is actually a pretty vibrant community for mathematicians, to the point where there's anecdotal reports of people putting their Math Overflow reputation score on their CVs and using it for tenure promotion. So I think that's pretty exciting. And so the idea is the second revolution started. Peter Winkler, who did Scientometrics, said that the citation graph data is like Chekhov's gun, right, in drama. Like once you bring it on stage, it has to be fired. I think that's true of Altmetrics data as well. Once we have this data, it has to be used. It's going to be used. The question is just how can we use it most effectively for scholarship? And Chekhov, lol, Trek joke. Oh, all right. Any questions in the 1.5 minutes we have remaining? Yes, sir.
So a lot of your system depends on sort of buzz and reputation measurements. How does that going to affect new researchers or people trying to break into a paper?
It's a good question. I think it affects, for me, it would be good. And I think for a lot of young researchers it would be good. The reason is it's very easy for an anonymous peer reviewer to just squash your ideas because they don't like them, because they're new. So Horovin wrote this famous paper called Peer Review and the Suppression of Innovation, where he basically says peer review is basically just to keep the orthodoxy in power. And that's maybe a little conspiracy theorist, but there's certainly an element of truth in that. in a reputation-built system where you can see there's provenance for all the sources of my reputation, I think it's a lot harder for the orthodoxy to just squash something. They have to at least make an argument. Otherwise, they look kind of bad. So I think that it's a more transparent system. I think is good for people bringing up new ideas. I also think it's good for people bringing up new ideas because it has a higher dimensionality of data. So maybe I'm not very important in one particular field or in one particular way, but maybe I have impact in another way too. And as a young researcher, I can more easily sort of find my niche in that way. Yeah.
I kind of have a follow-up question about that one. So as new researcher, for example, maybe the data for new researcher is more about demonstrating others' impact as opposed to demonstrating their impact, right? So how do you motivate them into using the Altmetrics platform so that they will grant you permission to access their Facebook data, Twitter data, and all kinds of those stuff?
So I don't entirely understand your question. So I would say the young researcher would use it in the same way the old researcher would, or how I would use it. I'm building this for me, partly, right? I mean, everyone who builds something, they build it for themselves at some level. I want a live CV because I have some stuff that was published in not famous journals that got a lot of citations and got a lot of blog posts and tweets and stuff like that. I think it was meaningful. I think it made an impact, but you would never know looking at my traditional CV. So for me as a young researcher, that's a big advantage for me. I want to be able to show this had an impact in ways that maybe aren't represented in the current system. It's also really nice as a young researcher that Altmetrics accrue several orders of magnitude more quickly than traditional citations. So if I'm going in for tenure, I don't have to say, yeah, I'm going to have a lot of citations in 2 years, right? Like I can actually say right now, these are my numbers. Does that answer the question at all?
Yeah.
Okay, cool, yeah.
So you were sort of getting into this at the end of your presentation about the tipping point as what's going to have to change in order for this stuff to go through. But your examples, you sort of have this list of 4 or 5 bullet points for things that are generally going to propel this.
Yeah.
But the examples that you gave were much more disciplinary based rather than overarching or encompassing. Do you see this manifesting differently in different disciplines and that having an impact and
absolutely
all connect together?
Very much so. I mean, discipline, right? I mean, we talk about scholarship, but for most scholars, there's no scholarship, there's just their discipline, right? And disciplines have wildly varying norms and practices. So in math, this is already happening, right? I mean, people they publish their work in archive, they're on Math Overflow, like this is already, physics, same thing has already happened. Business and law, again, they're on SSRN, whereas, dentists, I happen to know, as a professional scholarly community, tend to be very conservative for whatever reason. And they're not going to adopt this stuff right away, right? And they're going to lag behind other people. And I think that's entirely reasonable. I mean, we see it in journals, right? I mean, in the today's scholarly publishing landscape, monographs are extremely important for a lot of humanists. Conference proceedings are extremely important for computer scientists. Articles are important for economists and much of the rest of scholarship. So I think it's absolutely true that there will be disciplinary differences in this. As someone who's interested in seeing it go forward, I tend to focus on those disciplines that I think of as more forward thinking. And so I tend to work more with them. But I think to some extent, although not a complete extent, positive examples are followed. Yep.
This is maybe more than a comment than a question.
Sure.
Property type stuff.
Absolutely, it's a great point. So one of the features scheduled for total impact is patents, because that's one of the good metrics of what people in industry do. I think another advantage of this is not just people in industry, but anyone, citizen scientists, right, who do interesting work, who have, there's a guy who works in a lot of this stuff he I think sells insurance for a living, but he connects a lot of interesting information. He's well respected in the community because he's able to communicate through these channels, which at least in the very narrow community of people like me who are interested in new forms of scholarly communication are valued. And so we value his contributions as part of the community. So I think for people in industry and people outside of industry, just like I said, citizen scientists, they're able to publish stuff on blogs, they're able to publish stuff in disciplinary repositories, and they're able, I think, to gain new legitimacy by being able to bring metrics of quality to their work, where before they couldn't, because the only metrics of quality were journals. All right, I'm keeping people too late, so I want to.
We're out of time. We're almost just about out of time, but why don't we do one more question?
Great, yeah, go for it.
So I had a question regarding the total impact, the connection between the authors that deposit into institutional repositories and the institutional repositories impact within total impact. Is there a way to separate the connection between those two, or to see that there are different connections between the author's impact as well as the institutional repository's impact?
Yeah, very much so. The way we built it is so that you can aggregate at any level. So for instance, I showed how you can aggregate by a grant. If you're a research funder, you're interested in what people on your grant did. So you bring that. If you're an institutional repository, you're interested in what things in your institutional repository did. So in the future, although it's still very beta right now, in the future, you'd be able to import everything in your IR into Total Impact. That would be a collection. And you'd be able to see summary statistics of that collection. If you're a research, you want to just do your stuff, you can do that. If you want to just do two things. I had this, we joke around with this. There was this picture of me on my couch in the Chronicle article, and I was joking because my roommate saw it, and she's like, "Our couch is famous." I was like, "Yeah, I was also involved, at least a little bit." But it's her couch, so that's, I guess, all she sees. But so we kind of jokingly made a Total Impact profile for Jason's couch, right? And it has a profile, and it has a certain number of tweets and stuff like that. It's pretty cool. But yeah, you can aggregate at any level, I guess is the point. And it is good for me at this point to make a disclaimer, which is that it's very much beta software right now. It works, but it breaks. Sometimes, and in unusual and unexpected ways. So a big part of our continued development between now and August is to develop sort of a product that can scale to having sort of tens of thousands of calls, like super reliable. So it's fun now. You'll probably be hearing about it more, hopefully in August, when we're trying to really publicize it a lot.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking Jason.
Thank you.